Hundreds of protesters breaching the highest security zone in the city, clashing with the police, battling tear gas shells, chanting slogans and carrying flags. They ultimately stormed into the country's top government building. Seething with anger, they seemed unstoppable. Now, you could mistake that these visuals that we are showing you are from Colombo, which witnessed a people's uprising. But this was a political protest happening thousands of miles away in Baghdad. Hundreds breached the Iraqi parliament. The demonstrators, all of them men, were seen walking on tables of the parliament floor. They were seen leafing through the folders, sitting on chairs of lawmakers and waving Iraqi flags. While some were seen relaxing on sofas and lounging in the parliament building, the others were dancing, cheering, clicking pictures as the security forces looked on, helpless. Most of the protesters were supporters of Moqtada Al-Sadr, a powerful Iraqi cleric who has been opposing Iran's interference in the country's politics. Prime Minister Mustafa Al-Kadhimi called on the protesters to immediately withdraw, but it took orders issued by the Shiite leader Al-Sadr before the crowd started to leave nearly 2 hours later. The protest was against the recent selection of Moqtada Al-Sadr as the official nominee of the Coordination Framework bloc, a coalition led by Iran-backed Shiite parties and their allies. The pro-Iranian candidate was picked to be the premier designate. For months now, Iraq is witnessing a political deadlock. 9 months ago, when elections were held in the country, Moqtada Al-Sadr's bloc emerged as the biggest parliamentary faction, winning 73 seats in the 329-seat parliament. But he was still far short of a majority. Al-Sadr had supported the idea of a majority government which would have sent his Shiite adversaries from the coordination framework into the opposition. And when this did not happen, in protest, Sadr's 73 lawmakers quit en masse. Sadr thought that this would pressurize his rivals to fast-track government formation. But in June this year, 64 new lawmakers were sworn in, making the pro-Iran bloc the largest in the parliament. Iran, with its militias and control over Iraq's political parties, started meddling into Baghdad's decision-making process after the 2003 US-led invasion. And this power has increased over the last decade. Hadi al-Amiri, a senior leader in the coordination framework, spent decades alongside Iranian forces in the Iran-Iraq war. Nouri al-Maliki, who served 2 terms as the Iraqi prime minister, commanded a military camp in Iran in the 1980s. After the US withdrawal in 2011, Iran's political influence became so pervasive that many dubbed Tehran as the kingmakers in Iraq. However, declining economic and political conditions in the country gave rise to backlash against Iran's influence. In 2019, protesters set fire to an Iranian consulate in Karbala and demanded that Iran cease its interference in Iraq. The mounting pressure forced the Iraqi government to resign and call for early elections. When Al-Sadr quit this year, some think tanks said it was a gift to Iran, while others called it a tactical maneuver to hand over the country to Iranian allies, with a strategic aim of pulling the rug from under their feet. But it remains unclear if this strategy would bear fruit or further embolden Iran. Iraq is enormously important to Iran as a strategic and economic asset. In October 2021, Iran's supporters failed to do better in elections because Iran's strongman, IRGC Quds Force Commander General Qasem Soleimani, had been assassinated by the United States. If Iraq does witness another election, Iran will make every conceivable effort to ensure its supporters win. Without massive protection from the United Nations, along with Arab and Western countries, Iran could very well influence the elections to suit its agenda. So it looks like Iraq's road to democracy could be a long and difficult one.
You blocked the road, you empire. It's trouble.
And for more on these developments, with me on the broadcast is Ahmad Zia Baram, who is a professor at the Department of Middle East Studies and also the director of Center for Iraq Studies at the University of Haifa in Israel. Thanks very much for being here. What do you make of the current situation on the ground in Iraq? What do you think lies ahead?
It's a pleasure to be with you. Moqtada Al-Sadr actually had, it's important to understand, he had a majority in parliament. Out of 329 MPs, he had 168, which is a small majority, but it is a majority. He was about, because he managed to create a very effective, very interesting, and even hopeful coalition that included almost all the Sunnis in parliament, 2/3 more or less of the Kurds in parliament, and his own party, Shi'i party, 73, as you said before. So he had the majority. The Iranians they panicked. The Iranians panicked because if Moqtada Al-Sadr, who is for independent Iraq, much less Iranian or no Iranian influence beyond neighborhood, and good neighborliness, if he won, had he won parliament and had he been able to appoint the prime minister, president, prime minister, government, Iran's influence in Iraq would have gone down. From now, it is about 60, 80% to perhaps 20 or 30%, which means they would lose control of Iraq. It happens also in Lebanon, but in Iraq, it's much more dangerous for them because Iraq, for the Iranians, is an absolute must. They have to control Iraq. The reason is that it is both a strategic asset of tremendous value, huge, critical value.
Yes.
And is also a source of fantastic income. About 1/3 of Iraq's oil revenues, about $100 billion a year, go to Tehran. Don't ask me how, that's another story. But Iran depends economically to a large extent on the Iraqi money and Iraqi oil revenues. So strategically, connection to Syria, Lebanon is hugely important, and economically because of that. Iran intervened. There was a majority for Moqtada Al-Sadr. It's very important to understand. I would call it a more or less anti-Iranian majorities. Are not anti-Iranian extreme or anything, but they don't want Iranian influence beyond reason in Iraq itself. And also a lot of corruption that comes with it. So the Iranians made a very clever move. They managed to convince their own man, who is the president of the Supreme Iraqi Constitutional Court, to enact a new rule, to introduce a new rule which is unconstitutional 100%. The rule it still goes, that having a majority in parliament is not enough. If you want to elect a president whose role is to choose a prime minister, you must have not just a majority, you need of voters, supporters, you need a 2/3 quorum, which means 221 members, while Moqtada Al-Sadr had only 168. That he was unable to do. He tried twice, and failed. So he became very exasperated, and he ordered, yes, as you said correctly, to order his own parliament members to resign, 73 of them. So now the pro-Iranians have a majority, more than slight, but they still don't have 2/3, which is the new rule which the Iranians introduced. So either the Iranians will find a way of convincing the chairman, the president of the court, to change the rule and, actually a majority is okay.
Right.
Or
so will these tensions...
I'll just say they go for another electoral campaign, which is complicated, hugely difficult. And in the meantime, Moqtada Al-Sadr, just end by that, in the meantime, Moqtada Al-Sadr is opting for an parliamentary activity. So he doesn't have any parliament members anymore, but he has supporters, Kurdish, Sunni, and so on. But
right. So will the current tensions on the ground and this political turmoil overall mean that it would increase Iranian influence and perhaps embolden Iran remains to be seen? We're leaving it there for the moment. Thanks very much for joining us on the broadcast here and sharing those perspectives. Good to have you. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.